Here we go. We're back looking at the Psalms together. Again, just getting an overview, introduction to them. I think it's very important to understand how the Psalms work and the structure and some of the details because they are the most well-known poetic book, but they do have some poetic features that are um, more unique to the biblical poetry we see in other books. So uh, tonight I wanted to address the topic of the psalm titles because I think there's some misunderstanding by some folks with them, and I thought it'd be helpful to take a look at the psalm titles, and then if we have time, why study the psalms? I just think that would be a good discussion to have. But here, as we consider the psalm titles, most of the psalms, about 116 of them, they contain a title or what's called superscript, which means script written before the psalm. And these titles often give helpful information about the author, or sometimes there's musical information. So, for example, if we take a look at the Psalms here, we can see a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. By the way, this is the first psalm in the Psalter that has a title. You will also notice many times the translation puts titles on the psalm. So that what I'm talking about is distinct from that. So, for example, if we start back in Psalm 1, notice the way of the righteous and the wicked. That is something written by the translator. They put their title to the psalm. Um, Psalm 2, the reign of Yahweh's anointed. Again, this is the Legacy Standard Bible title. We go to the English Standard Version. They don't typically, at least this version of the ESV doesn't have titles from the translator, but they do have the title from the psalm itself. You can see here again, Psalm 3, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom. We go to Psalm 4, to the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. Psalm 5, to the choir master for the flutes, a psalm of David. So those are the titles that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the translator title. Okay. So just keep that in mind. The difference, usually there'll be a change in font size or something like that between the translator title and the title of the psalm. So with that in mind, we can see a number of these psalms. We go to Psalm 6. Here's the title from the translator, so we're not talking about that, but notice there's a little bit longer title of the psalm for the choir director, the stringed instruments, according to the Sheminith, a psalm of David. So I'm sure you're familiar with these as you've read through the psalms, but many have wondered, are these actually part of the original psalm, or was this title added later? Um, and I'm going to argue from, not argue like mad, but just I'm going to present a case for the fact that these psalm titles are actually part of the original psalm, put there by the original author. And so I want to present to you a few reasons why um, I believe that is the case, and then also why it matters. Why is it important? These are just titles. Who cares? Why don't we just focus on the psalm? So I want to talk about that as well. Why I believe they're part of the inspired text and why that is important for us. Okay? So with that in mind, let me give you a few reasons why these psalm titles or superscriptions, why they are considered, why they should be considered part of the original inspired text. The first reason is they are authentic. They are authentic. We can see that they're the part of the inspired text as we compare some of these. For example, let me show you paste it here. This is Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22. And notice in Psalm 18, down here, maybe we could have Chun-Si, would you mind reading that for us? The Psalm 18.
Sure. For the choir director, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold.
Okay, now if you could read, this is from 2 Samuel 22. If you could read these two verses I put there.
And David spoke the words of this song to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer.
Okay, so we should notice here right away, David spoke the words of the psalm, right? That all of this is exactly what's given in Psalm 18. All right. And then he said, the Lord is my rock, fortress, my deliverer. This is in 2 Samuel 22. And then, my God, my rock, to whom I take refuge, my deliverer. So we can see the same kind of information. But notice that if we go to 2 Samuel 22, we were just to do that, right? If we're reading along in our Bibles and we come to 2 Samuel 22 and we get to this chapter, and then we read the words that Chun-Si just read, well, would we question whether or not verse 1 is part of the text? Right? It's there as part of 2 Samuel. In fact, in the original, there wouldn't be chapter and there wouldn't be a title here by the translator, right? It would just go from these four were born to the giants in Gath. This is chapter 21. And then it would come to these words in verse 1 of chapter 22, introducing this psalm from David, this poem. And verse 1, we would take as just that's part of the inspired text. Well, if you go to Psalm 18, it's the exact same information that's given as part of the title. So it's the same exact statement made from 2 Samuel 22, verse 1, introducing the poem there. The title here in Psalm 18 is simply introducing the psalm in Psalm 18, which almost exactly matches 2 Samuel 22. There are some differences that we believe, David, when the writer of 2 Samuel wrote and highlighted a few things. Then David, who wrote this psalm, distinctly, separately, put it in, or it became part of the Psalter because it was recognized as inspired text. And so we see here is an example of an actual psalm that was also given in the Old Testament narrative in 2 Samuel. And how it's introduced in 2 Samuel is exactly the same way it is introduced here in the psalm. I think that indicates that the title here of this psalm, the superscript, is authentic. Another support for these titles being a part of, that we should consider them part of the actual inspired text of the psalm, is seen by the fact that not only are they authentic, but they're ancient, right? As you go through the Psalms, I'm sure you've noticed that there are these particular words that aren't really even translated. In fact, we saw this when we were going to Psalm 6, right? according to the Sheminith Psalm of David. Well, what is the Sheminith? Well, that's actually the Hebrew word that is put in the title. And they have, noticed, possibly an 8-string instrument or a title for a tune. Notice that word possibly. The translators aren't sure for 100%. But they think Shemanim is a reference to this type of instrument, but they left it in, the Hebrew word in, they just transliterated it in English letters, but they left it as Sheminith because they aren't exactly positive of the translation. We go to Psalm 7, the Shigaon of David. Well, again, they don't translate this Hebrew word, which, notice it says possibly a wild, passionate, animated song. Okay, so they left it as Shigaon because they aren't certain to translate it that way. We could go down to Psalm 16. You'll see this one quite often, a miktam of David, possibly an atonement psalm, an epigrammatic poem. Again, they left the Hebrew word there, miktam. If we go to Psalm 32, we'll see miktam several places. A maskil, also a common in the psalm titles. But again, it's the Hebrew word left untranslated. And here it says possibly a contemplative, didactic, or skillful psalm. I mentioned to you last session the wisdom psalms. Often the wisdom psalms have this title in them, a maskil. I think we looked at one example from Psalm 78. Notice a maskil of Asaph. So maskil is likely a reference to, again, notice they said it's possibly a didactic, an instructional psalm, a wisdom psalm. But they aren't 100% positive, so they just left the term as maskil. Couple other examples. We could go to Psalm 46. Notice for the choir director of the sons of Korah, according to Alamoth, a song. Okay, Alamoth is a Hebrew word. It likely means to the deaf. But here they think it means, one translation might be soprano voices, but literally Alamoth is death. And al to the deaf, potentially it could mean, but here they aren't sure, so they left it as the Hebrew word, and they think maybe it's a musical term for soprano voice. I guess if the soprano voices aren't very good, that could be deadly for you, right? But it's kind of a strange thing. So we see a number of psalms like this, where these Hebrew words are left there, just transliterated, the English letters put their place so you can pronounce the word. So what does this tell us? Well, many scholars believe it's because these words are old and frequently used that they are not clear as to what their meaning could be. And what's interesting is even the writers of the Septuagint, who are they wrote the Septuagint, right? It was written in northern Egypt. It was a translation from Hebrew into Greek. It was probably done around 250 to 150 BC, 100, 250 years before Jesus. And even they did not know the meaning of those terms. And so if you look at, let's just check it out. Let's see, I'll pull up the Septuagint here. So if we go to, let's say, Psalm 6, right, or 7, which was the Shigion of David. Here it just says the Psalm of David, which to the Lord he sang. So they doesn't even put the word in there, actually. Shigion is not even put in there. Or Psalm 6, as we looked at in the Legacy Standard, right? It says, with stringed instruments according to Sheminith. Well, the Septuagint doesn't even put it in there. So, so they didn't, looks like they just skipped the term altogether in this. Interesting. So, so that indicates that these words are old terms, not modern, not words that were written during the days of the Septuagint or, added by an author later after David. Because if they were added later, we would assume or think that they would have been words that were known then by the time the Septuagint translators got to them. If they were written after David wrote them, more recently to the Septuagint translators, then they would likely have been terms they would have understood. But the fact that they weren't, and they're sort of left out of Septuagint in many cases, but many modern Hebrew scholars don't even know what they meant, indicates they're likely older terms, that they may have been written several hundred years before the Septuagint, which would have placed them in the time period of the original writers. So they are ancient relative to the more recent translation of the Septuagint. Any questions so far on this? You can just interrupt me if you have any as we go along here. Another support is, notice the accuracy of these titles, that they are affirmed. We go to, so for example, let's look at Psalm 16. Notice here, who does it say wrote the psalm? It's a miktam of whom? All right, we can see there, David. Okay, so it's a miktam of David. Well, if we go to Acts chapter 12, sorry, chapter 2. This is Peter's well-known sermon at Pentecost. And notice verse 25. For David says of him, referring to Christ, I saw the Lord continually before me. Because he's at my right hand, I will not be shaken. He's quoting Psalm 16. And he affirms David as the author. And Psalm 16, that's what we learn in the title of the psalm, that it's David who wrote it. Paul, the Apostle Paul, in Acts 13. He says in another psalm, you will not give your Holy One over to corruption. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep. So he knows the author is David. Paul affirms the author of Psalm 16 as David, which is exactly what the title of the psalm tells us. Another example, Psalm 110. Notice, of David, a psalm. That's the title given here by the author, by David. And then Luke, in Luke chapter 20, Jesus speaking here, right, when he was being questioned by the scribes and Pharisees, said to them, this was the question that shut them up. He says, how is it that they say the Christ is David's son? For David says of himself in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet. Notice, Jesus affirms David as the author of, this is a quote from Psalm 110. And again, in Psalm 110, David is listed as the author of the psalm. And so these indicate that these New Testament references, and there are some more, but I just gave you a few, that they recognize the title of the psalm as being accurate. They affirm, in these cases, these examples, they affirm David as the author, and he is the one listed in the title of these psalms. So I think that would affirm or support these titles being part of the inspired text. Okay, so they're authentic, they are ancient, they are accurate. And we've already looked at Psalm 18 as the title of the psalm there we saw is the same one as given in Psalm 2 Samuel 22. But notice here's another interesting feature. We find some titles to poems outside of the Psalms. There's a couple of examples, one of them being, we just saw Psalm 2 Samuel 22, where David introduces, or the author of 2 Samuel introduces David's psalm with the same title as given, the same description as given in the Psalm 18 title. But notice as well, Habakkuk. Let's look Habakkuk 3 up. This is a very interesting example, right? We know Habakkuk chapters 1 and 2. Habakkuk was having this dialogue with the Lord, right? He was concerned about the wickedness in Judah and was asking God, are you going to do anything about this? And then God, of course, right, he says, yes, I'm going to send the Babylonians. They will bring consequences. And then Habakkuk says, what? The Babylonians, they're more wicked than the people of Israel. So he was very concerned about that. And God said, the Babylonians will be judged as well. But he was warning Habakkuk that difficult times were coming. The Babylonians were going to come and bring consequences. Well, then Habakkuk ends the psalm with this word of affirmation that he will trust in Yahweh and exalt him no matter what comes. And notice how this poem by Habakkuk is introduced. It's part of the text of Habakkuk. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to, look at that, one of those ancient terms, the Shigian oath. This is a title. This is a title that Habakkuk puts to this poem. And notice also, by the way, how Habakkuk ends this poem. I will exult in Yahweh. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Yahweh, the Lord, is my strength. He has set my feet like hinds' feet and makes me tread on high places. And then notice this. For the choir director on my stringed instruments. So here we see an example. And by the way, this would be called a subscript because it's written after the psalm. And in verse 1, it would be called a superscript, written before the psalm. But these are simply titles that were given by Habakkuk for this particular poem. So it's the same thing that we see in the Psalms. Again, I already mentioned 2 Samuel 22, where we see an introduction to this poem in 2 Samuel 22. That is essentially a title, a superscript to the poem, the same superscript given to Psalm 18. Or another example, Isaiah 38, verse 9. After Ahaz remember he was ill and cried out to God, and God gave him another 15 years and affirmed that by causing his shadow to go up to the wall. You guys remember that story? Well, here, as Hezekiah writes a poem to express this story, notice how it's introduced. Verse 9, a writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after his illness and recovery. That's a superscript, or as we might call it, a psalm title. It's giving background information to the poem. All right. Other examples, we could look at 2 Samuel 23. All right, there's a poem introduced here, and notice it's introduced. These are the last words of David. Or we could go to Hannah's poem in 2 Samuel, or no, it's not Hannah, it's David's Lament. Right, notice there's this poem here, verse 19 and following, And it's introduced, there's introductory information. There's a superscript. David chanted this funeral lament. So it gives information to the background of this poem. Or we could go to Proverbs 10, or maybe a better one is Proverbs 31. The poem there, notice verse 1, the words of King Lemuel, the oracle unto which his mother disciplined him or spoke to him, taught him. And then we have of course, the poem given to Samuel that focuses on the godly woman. But this is a superscript. It's giving background information to the poem. So we see here several examples outside of the book of Psalms, and there's several others I didn't include. We could look at one more, Numbers 24. This was Balaam, of course, his poetic oracle that he spoke. And notice there's an introduction to it. He took up his discourse and said, so there are a number of examples outside of the Psalms where a poem is introduced. It's given an introduction. It's given a superscript, just like we see in the Psalms. And as I said, if we go to the example from Habakkuk 3, we see the exact kind of information we find in a Psalm. This ancient term of instruction to the reader or singer of the psalm. Again, in this case, Shigionoth, they think might mean a wild, passionate, animated song. So that would give information regarding the way the song should be sung and indicating the tone of this particular poem. Okay, so I think this is a really strong support for the fact that the psalm titles are a part of the original psalm. We see in these texts outside of the Psalms, superscripts being written right before the poem, and nobody would question whether, at least no one that believes in inerrancy would question that they're part of the text, right? 2 Samuel 22 and Isaiah 38 and Habakkuk 3, right? Then 2 Samuel 23, Proverbs 31, they're clearly part of the text given as an introduction to the background for each of the poems. So why would we think it's any different for the Psalms? This seems to be a practice that some poems, when they were written, were given an introduction or background to the poem by the original author. Now, that's, again, the case in several of these examples outside of the Psalms. My contention, my argument is it's no different in the Psalms, that the psalmist at times wanted to give some background information, either as to the setting of the psalm, who wrote the psalm, the tone of the psalm, the events surrounding when the psalm was written, the purpose of the psalm. Remember last time we met, we saw a group of psalms called the Songs of Ascent. And that is where the author indicated the intent of those psalms was to be sung as the people ascended to Jerusalem during one of the 3 annual feasts. And so those titles, those superscripts, are given by the author. They weren't added later. Again, because of the fact that they're authentic, we see them matching in a couple of places, matching in 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18, that they're ancient, they're old. Some of the terms in these superscripts are very old, so very unlikely they'd be added later. They're also accurate. Again, we saw examples of in the New Testament from Psalms being quoted. They affirmed the author who was given in the original Psalm title. And then there are also examples of these inscriptions, these superscriptions, these titles are found outside of the Psalms. And so I think all of these together, and there's one more. But before we get to that one, does this make sense? Are there any questions that you guys have or comments or other thoughts as we talk about this? Anybody? All right, let me give you one more support for the fact that these psalm titles are part of the original text, and that is, I say they are affirmed, meaning that, um, let me see, I have an example of this. Let me show you got my Hebrew text here. I'll just look up one of these Psalms here. Psalm is Psalm 16. Okay, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but this is you may have it's a Hebrew Bible, copy of a Hebrew Bible. And you'll notice here a few features. Okay, notice the text of the Hebrew Bible is here. Okay, the larger font. You guys can see that, I hope. And then there's information on the side and on the bottom. This is called the Masora Parva. There's terms for it. These are Aramaic abbreviations. Down here is textual information. All right, but notice here in this section, this is the actual text. And I show this because as the Hebrew manuscripts were passed down and copied, they would not put anything in this section. There will be notes on the side and notes on the bottom sometimes, but mostly on the side. And they would be notes about like how many times a certain word in that line is found in the book. There would be notes about the position of this particular word. This is like the word is exactly in the center of the book, or this phrase. So these are notes by the copyists that would be a reference for the next copyist. So if you received a Hebrew manuscript, say this is Psalm 16, for example, is right here and right here, you'd have the manuscript to copy. And then you would have these statements on the side written by the previous copyist that you would use to ensure the accuracy of your copy. So you would write, you would copy down letter for letter, you go along, all right? You wouldn't put anything else in this section but the text itself. You wouldn't put any notes in here, comments in here. That would go on the side, outside of the main text. And so like this note might say, I forgot, I used to know what these terms refer to. I think this one is, I don't remember. But like I said, oftentimes they would be instructions about how many times a particular word appears or something like that. So what the copyist could do is after he copies that line, he would check that instruction to make sure, yep, this word appears 3 times in the psalm. And so, yeah, I copied it correctly. If there was any mistake, they would take this, even if it's one letter that's off, they wouldn't scratch it out and rewrite it in. They would take the manuscript and they would get rid of it. They would either burn it or they would store it in a container and bury it. So if there was anything different in this section, they would just get rid of it, start over. Even if they got to the end, the last line of the psalm, and they found an error, the whole song gets thrown away. Which, by the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you remember how they were found? back in, was it 1948 in Israel? They found them in the caves, right? They were in clay containers. They were probably being thrown away because as you look at the manuscripts, they had writing in here. And so it's likely that many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were put in those jars because that's what they would do with manuscripts, texts that had any kind of copying errors. And so it's believed that some believe that the many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because you can look at them, you'll find there's handwritten things inside of here that are different than the actual text. So it's very likely that someone had kept them and used them for study, but then they just buried them because that's what they would do with any copies that weren't 100% matching the previous copy. They were extremely careful about the copying process. And so I bring that up because if you'll notice here, again, sorry if you can't see it, but it says, Miktam of David. That's the Psalm superscription. It's written in this section where they would have no additional writing. So if you go to the oldest Hebrew manuscripts, you will find the Psalm titles in the same area. And like here's another one. That's for Psalm 17. Title of Psalm 17 is written along with the rest of the psalm. So even the oldest copyists considered the titles, it's part of the original text. And so they would copy them exactly as they received them. And so the original, this of course is a copy of a copy of a copy, but it reflects the original text would have been written with the title as part of the text. So don't know if that was helpful or confusing or not, but basically the copyists affirmed, they recognized these superscriptions are part of, should be considered part of the inspired text. That's why they were kept in that middle section with the text. Okay. If they had thought they were added or additional notes at some point, they would not have continued to copy them in that as part of the original poem itself. So I think a strong case can be made that these are not added later by somebody else, that they're part of the original poem given by the author, and given because the author wanted to convey, wanted to give us some background information to the psalm, either who wrote it, or the situation in which it was written, or the musical instruction given. Because again, many of these psalms were intended to be sung. And so all of these, I think, point to the fact that it is inspired text. Thoughts on that? Is this something you guys have considered before, or is this new information to you, or have you wrestled with this issue before yourself? What do we do with the psalm titles?
Now, well, what does Spurgeon? Spurgeon has what does he do with all this? I wondered because I had that, and then when I left Singapore, and I wasn't sure if I was ever getting back here, I sent it all off and gave it to my son-in-laws, so I don't have them. But what does Spurgeon do with all this?
Well, there's my. So I got Treasury of David. See if he comments on find where's yeah. Let's see. Let's see if he comments on the title. Let's see, Psalm.
Well, I don't think Spurgeon would have known Hebrew because I don't think that perhaps he ever studied Hebrew or Greek.
Yeah, I mean he put the title in, you know, as part of the text. I'm just trying to see if he made any comments about it. I have to look through. He does put on, actually, here's an example. Yeah, he does make comments on it. You know, when he puts in, like he'll often put in like other commentators in his day that he studied, right? You guys familiar with Treasury David, right? These are Spurgeon's notes on the Psalms, but he also puts notes or comments from other commentators. So he compiles, it's really a very rich resource, but he compiles notes from, comments from other scholars as well as his own. And here at the beginning of this Psalm, Psalm 51, he does put some comments by other scholars on the titles. So one is by J.A. Alexander, who makes a comment about the title of the psalm. So that would indicate a couple things. One, that Spurgeon recognizes the titles are part of the text, and also these other scholars in his day and before understood or interpreted the titles as they would the rest of the psalm, that they recognize them as part of inspired text and would provide interpretive notes to them. So, yeah, that indicates Spurgeon would affirm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have to admit that, before this, I always thought that this is probably someone inserted inside there. And it always says that, to the choir masters, or is it Psalm of David? I thought it's okay, somebody just add a footnote to it and say that, okay, yeah, just to explain the psalm.
Yeah, that's a pretty common idea there. But I think, like, for example, when we look at those passages outside of the Psalms, we see the author of the book putting those introductory notes in, like Habakkuk. And I don't think we would say there, oh, somebody came later and inserted that. It's just part of the flow of the book, or 2 Samuel 22 or Isaiah 38. So if those, people would not assume those were added part of the book, I don't see why why would we assume the Psalms, someone added them later. But that's a pretty common explanation given more often by modern commentators, by the way. If you look at the older ones, like Spurgeon's day and before, I think they often affirmed the title as part of the text from the author.
But Pastor Tim, does this all this give more information about the background and everything, or is more like just slight information only?
It depends, right? Some of the Psalms have no superscript, so we have no background information. Other Psalms, right, if we just take a look, other Psalms may just have the author. Okay, this has some information, right? Musical instruction, and then the author. Psalm 7, musical instruction, the author. Psalm 8. But then you can get, like I said, get up to like Psalm 120. The only thing given there is it's a song of ascents. Some Psalms just have the author. Psalm 90. Well, this is a prayer of Moses, the man of God. It's listed as a prayer. What's the other one written by Solomon? Song of Ascents. And then he wrote, yeah, Psalm 72 just says of Solomon. So that's not a lot of information. However, just knowing that Solomon wrote it is a helpful piece of information because we know a lot about Solomon. Many chapters written about him. We know a lot about David. We know a lot about, right? We have the Psalm 46 written by of the sons of Korah song. Psalm 73. All we have here is who wrote it. But that gives us some insight into the background, because now we know if Asaph wrote the psalm, we know that Asaph was a leader in temple music, worship, that was appointed by David. And so we know then when this psalm was written. And then we have statements like verse 17 that says, I came into the sanctuary of God. Well, we know at that time, in the days of David, the temple had not yet been built. There was just the tabernacle that was carried around in the wilderness, the one that Moses, the constructed days of Moses. So when that psalm was written, it was the tabernacle was the tent that David had built or put up at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which would then become the actual temple later under Solomon. So there are certain details just by knowing the author that help give us a little better understanding of the background of the psalm. But then some psalms, like Psalm 51, for example, gives us a lot of the background information because it tells us the Psalm of David. So David wrote it when Nathan the prophet came to him after he'd gone into Bathsheba. Well, here we know exactly the historical background there. We can go back over to 2 Samuel 11 and read all about it. And then 2 Samuel 12 is when Nathan confronted David. And it's following that confrontation that David writes this poem, right? Notice when Nathan came to him. Okay, so we know this psalm was written in at 2 Samuel 12, and we know the exact background. So that's very great information. Psalm 52, we're given a lot of background. We're given the exact time it refers to. A Maskil, a wisdom psalm of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Well, that took place in 1 Samuel 22. So we have the whole story there, the whole background. So sometimes these titles will give us information that really opens up. We know the whole setting of the psalm and exactly what prompted it to be written. But then other times, I think if I go back to Psalm like 50, we just have, like I said, the author. And then other times, oops. That. Other times we have there's no information. I'm trying to find Psalm 116. This is the translator title, but there's no title given by the author. All right. Psalm 117, no superscription. Psalm 118, no superscription. Again, this is just from the translator, so that's not. Psalm 119, right? These are given by the translator. There's no superscription, right? People argue about, well, who wrote this psalm? Well, we don't know. He didn't say. So there are like 34 psalms, I think, that are without any title at all. So that's zero information on the background, but sometimes even studying the psalm itself, we can get an idea of the background. For example, Psalm 119, there are many, many references to him being oppressed, attacked, persecuted, and also many references to the fact he is struggling. So he repeats many times, revive me according to your word, enlighten my eyes according to your word. So we know this, the background of Psalm 119, it wasn't just written to be a statement on Bible, but it actually was written by somebody who was struggling, was discouraged, was under attack, was being persecuted and maligned. People were speaking against him. And so he wrote that psalm to affirm his trust in God's word and to affirm that he would keep God's word and to ask God to revive him. So we can study the psalm and get some of the background information at times, but often the titles are a great insight into the setting of the psalm. Sometimes not a lot of information, but sometimes a great deal of information. So it just, again, it's like any inspired text in scripture, right? That we're given the exact information that the Holy Spirit intends for us to have in order to understand and interpret the text. Sometimes he will give us a lot of information in the background, sometimes not as much. For example, there are many books in the Bible that we don't know who the author is. We know it's inspired, but like Samuel, for example, Kings, Chronicles, Joshua, Judges, we aren't given who the author is directly. Now, there are some good possibilities, but other books like, you know, the Pentateuch, we know who was the author of that because the Bible tells us Moses wrote that. Many of the prophetic books, in fact, I would contend all of them were written by the prophet. The Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John, we can be pretty confident that they were written by those authors. But Matthew and Mark, we're not told who authored them. We rely on the early church who affirm that. But the books themselves don't tell us directly. So many books of the Bible, just like some of the Psalms, we don't know who the author is. So we know less about the background of the writer. But we can study those books and still understand likely who the original recipients are. And then also we can get some other background information like when it happened and places, the people. It's the same with the Psalms. So the titles, though, I think, you know, I'm making the case for the fact that we should consider those titles as original to the psalm from the author who intended to give some background information to the psalm, either just himself who wrote it or sometimes additional background information that will help the reader to understand the setting of that particular psalm. Because all the psalms were written, prompted by the author to write because of some circumstance or occasion around him, just like the epistles. The epistles were written in response to something, problem, a situation, a concern, or just where the author had some reason that prompted him to write that letter to that church or that person. It's the same with the Psalms. Some situation or feeling or issue arose, and the psalmist wrote a poem in response to that, or wrote a poem with the intent to instruct on a particular topic to a particular group of people. And so at times, more often than not, he would give a title or a superscript to the psalm to give us some background information he thought would be helpful for us to better understand that psalm. Just like some epistles, I'll have a lot of information given at the beginning, and some not as much. Some just have an epistle where just the author and the recipients are mentioned. But then other epistles, there'll be more information put into the introduction that the author thought would be helpful for the readers to better understand his message. So the reason I, bring all this up is this isn't some technical academic detail that's interesting to talk about or think about. But if it is part of the inspired text, and it is, then we should treat it with the same effort that we do the rest of the psalm, that we should translate it, that we should seek to interpret it and understand what it's saying, just like we do the rest of the psalm. It's part of the inspired text. It's intended by the human and divine author to be there for us to better understand that particular psalm. It's God-breathed scripture, those titles. And I think what got me concerned about it, fired up about it, some translations they don't put the titles in there. Some translations thought they weren't part of the original text and just left them out. I think today's English version is one of those that did that. Let me see if, before I speak out of turn, let me. Is that the Good News translation, I think? So yeah, if we go to Psalm 51, be merciful. There's no reference to, there's no title.
Did that young man come from
the title was left out. Sorry, I'm not sharing the screen, am I? Sorry about that. Here's today's English version. There's no title given. This is they don't even have the chapters in this one. This is chapter 50. And then here, chapter 51 begins here, and it just starts in the body of the psalm. There's no title given. Let me look at Psalm 52. Yeah, Psalm 52 begins here. No superscript. So this translation just left the superscripts out. I wonder what they did for Habakkuk. Curious. Okay, well, in Habakkuk, though, they left it in. Okay, interesting. But I'm concerned about that because the superscripts are part of the inspired text. And we had some warnings from God, didn't we, about omitting scripture? Revelation 22, right? Don't leave anything out. Don't add anything in. Deuteronomy, was it 28 or something? It said the same thing. Do not add to my words or take away. And Proverbs also, I think there's a warning. So whoever translated today's English version there's some accountability there because they took out inspired text. They left it out. And by not putting those psalm titles in. So to me, that's a serious, just like what if they left out John 3:16 or other verses that they didn't think were part of the original? I think we'd have a problem with that. So by leaving out these titles, it sends a bad message, a wrong message. Well, if you don't think this is part of the original text, then you can just leave it out. Thomas Jefferson did that, by the way. One of the founding fathers. He essentially compiled a New Testament where he took out all the things he thought were not really in the original Bible. he didn't believe in miracles, so he took out all the miracles. He took out a few other things as well. It's called the Jefferson Bible. So he just removed things that he didn't think were supposed to be there. Not a good idea. So I think we need to treat these titles as they were intended, which was part of what the original author wanted to communicate to.
Is the Jefferson Bible popular?
No, not these days. I think when it first came out, it was read by many, but he wasn't Christian. He was a deist. And actually, the book ends. It's kind of interesting. I have a picture somewhere of the last page of that Bible, and it ends with Jesus in the tomb. No resurrection. So it's pretty. It's pretty bad. But yeah, it's very well known, very famous. Questions? Any other questions or comments? I find the psalm titles, the superscriptions, very helpful at times in giving a background and setting to the psalm. That really helps to open up an understanding of the psalm. There's one other thing. This will be academic, guys, a little bit, but it's interesting, I think. So if you could bear with me. One more thing regarding the psalm titles, and that is this is known as Thurtle's theory. I don't know if you familiar with man J.W. Thurtle. I think he's from 19th century. He actually, in studying the psalm superscriptions, the titles, he came up with an idea that the superscription of the psalm titles, which has the musical information, like to the choir director, actually should be at the end of the previous psalm. So, for example, when we were looking at Psalm 46, let me try. Let me see, Psalm 16, 17. Yeah, so Psalm 18. For the choir director, you see that there? Many psalms begin that way. All right, we could. Okay, so Psalm 18 begins that way. Psalm 19 for the choir director, a psalm of David. Psalm 20, choir director, psalm of David. Psalm 21, you can go through. Psalm 22, it lists that for the choir director. And then sometimes there's more musical information. Like here, is one of those, the Ijeleth Hashashar, or Hashshahar, sorry, that this is a musical instruction. Well, Thurtle, J.W. Thurtle, kind of studied the Psalms, and he came up with this theory that this musical information actually should be at the end of the previous psalm. So that this actually should be at the end of Psalm 21. Right? He would say that this musical information actually goes at the end of the previous psalm. Now, why did he say that? Because for a couple of reasons. One is we see examples of this, for example, in Habakkuk 3. Notice this again has a superscript, prayer of Habakkuk, so it gives information about the author. All right. And then at the end of the psalm, it says, for the choir director on my stringed instruments. So here in Habakkuk 3, it has that pattern. There's a superscript, which gives background to the author, and then there's a subscript. There's something written at the end, which is the choir, the musical information. So here's an example outside of the Psalms where we see that pattern. Isaiah 38 begins again with information. Information about the author, the background a little bit. And then at the end of his poem, notice he says there's a musical instruction at the end. Another interesting thing he brings up, Psalm 56, for the choir director, according to Janoth Elem Rahakim. Okay, and this is translated as the silent dove of those who are far off. So notice Jonath, Jonah means dove, so it's the same word. And then it has a miktam of David, and miktam, it's a certain kind of poem. But he would contend this really makes more sense if it's connected to Psalm 55 above it. That this really, again, this musical instruction here should go at the end of this psalm. Why? Because there's nothing in Psalm 56 that has anything to do with a dove or a bird, anything like that. But if you go back to Psalm 55, verse 6, the word dove or Jonah is there. Oh, that wings like a dove, like Jonah, Yonah would be the pronunciation. Would fly away and be at rest. I would wander far away. And he says, so it would make more sense for this according to Jonathan Rehokim, to be at the end of Psalm 55. Another example he brings up, Psalm 88. Notice it says a psalm of the sons of Korah for the choir director, according to Mahalath Leonoth. And then it says a maskil of Haman the Ezrahite. Well, now it sounds like, well, who is it? Is it the sons of Korah or Haman? And I don't recall or remember Haman being, he's an Ezrahite. I don't think he is part of the sons of Korah. So it looks like, it appears like there's two authors here. But then notice, if you were to take this here and if it were at the end of the previous psalm, let me shrink this a little bit here. Notice something very interesting. I don't know if you can see this, guys. Can you see the of the sons of Korah, a psalm, a song? You guys see that? Notice a song, a psalm of the sons of Korah here. That is an inclusio. You guys remember inclusio? Where the same thing is repeated at the beginning and end of a particular. Well, we have, and it's, by the way, reversed here. So this would be a chiastic inclusio. See if I can write this here. Can't spell real good with my mouse. Inclusio. All right, so he contends in his study that actually this, if this were at the end of the psalm, it's his contention, it's musical information, right? A song, the sons of Korah for the choir director. He would put that at the end based on his theory, and then it would make sense that it goes with the previous psalm because it would be an inclusio, and it would get rid of the problem that we have here regarding two authors of this psalm, Heman and the sons of Korah. Two authors of the Psalm 88.
Pastor
So,
Tim, I have a question then.
yeah, sure.
Um, well, we know that, other book of the Bible, like, someone so much later, they have divided all the books into chapters and verses, right? So there's, not part of the original writing. But
Yeah.
how about the Psalm? Who divide them into, like, Psalm 1, 2, 3, 4, until 150?
Yeah,
Is
that's a
it
great
someone who, come later and do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. How are the Psalms compiled? We discussed that. I think you missed that session. We talked a little bit about how they were put together because they were written over a period of time, right? Moses, the oldest Psalm is from Moses, back 1400 BC, Psalm 90. And then there are many Psalms from David and Solomon, the sons of Korah, so around 1000 BC to 900. And then there are some Psalms written during or after the exile in Babylon. So that's what, 500 BC. So they spread out over a long period of time. And these Psalms were collected into 5 books. So they were compiled by someone else later. It's believed that the first and second book compiled by David, because most of the Psalms are from him. So that would be chapters 1 to 72 is the first book. Here, I can even show you the, give me a minute to find that. Where is that? Sorry, let me look this up. I think it will help to see this table again. Yeah, there we are. Okay, let me pull up this guy here. So this was a table that we put together with book 1 was Psalm 1 to 41, book 2 was 42 to 72, and the compilers are shown down here, possible compilers of the first book was likely David, because almost all the Psalms are written by him. The second and third books believed to be compiled by Hezekiah and Josiah. And the reason for that is Hezekiah, it's stated in Proverbs 25 that Hezekiah these are the Proverbs which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, transcribed. So they actually, this is an example we see directly here. Now, they didn't add to the text at all, but they compiled the Proverbs in a certain order and arrangement as they copied them. So some believe then that perhaps those guys also did so for the Psalms. The Psalm work collection, and they were recognized as inspired texts, but there were those that came along that then ordered them in a certain way. And we can see that ordering is intentional because of the last verses in those, the last psalm of each of those books, the last verse of each of those psalms at the end of the book has the same statement. So we can see that someone obviously intentionally organized them for that. Now, these compilers did not write the Psalms. They did not add to the Psalms. They simply ordered them. And so it's believed that Ezra, perhaps Nehemiah, was the last one to compile the final two books of the Psalms, because it would have to be somebody after the exile, since there are some Psalms from the exile there. So all this is to show that we do have, that there were compilers who ordered the Psalms, just like we have guys that compiled the New Testament epistles, right? They're not put in order of that they were written in time. They're compiled, they're put together with the epistles to Paul, right? In the beginning, Romans to Philemon. And then you have Hebrews and James, and you have the epistles of Peter, John. So those were collected, the two epistles of Peter. So there's evidence, the Bible itself, the ordering of the Bible was put together by somebody, many people probably over time. And so the same thing happened with the Psalms. There was a collection of these independent poems that were put together. They were recognized as inspired text and then ordered. And those who did the compiling, put them in a certain order, and they gave thought to it. So, but that ordering is not inspired. It's just, some men who understood the text very well and ordered them in a certain way that made sense thematically. So we don't connect the Psalms together. They're independent poems. But somebody did recognize common themes or common authors, or like the Songs of Ascent. They were put together, even though they were written over a long period of time. Some by David, Solomon, and then some later after the exile. But they were all Songs of Ascent. So they were compiled, placed together in order. So it's very possible that in that process, as the Psalms were collected in order and arranged and then later copied, and they didn't have chapter titles, they didn't have chapter numbers or verse numbers. Some believe it's possible that some copies were placed close together so that the musical instruction was thought to be the title to the next psalm. So that's why you'll see most of the Psalms have the musical instruction first for the choir director. And then some. But if you look at Habakkuk 3, he put that at the end. So that's why Thurtle thinks that maybe somewhere along the way in the copying process, the subscript and superscript got put together. But it's called Thurtle's theory because it's a theory. So I tend to agree with him. I think he makes a good case. But honestly, when I preach through the Psalms, I don't bring it up in my sermons. It's a little bit of a technical thing. It's not 100% confirmed. Again, I think it makes sense. Now, if I were teaching Psalm 55 or Psalm 87 and Psalm 88, I might bring it up. Psalm 55, I might or Psalm 56, because it might be confusing. What is the reference to the dove doing in this psalm? So I might take an opportunity there to comment on that. But normally I don't address it as part of, to the congregation. Of course, I bring it up to you guys because we're doing a more in-depth study of the Psalms here. But it's a theory, but I think it has some merit. I think it has some reasonable, and it does bring more helpful insight to those examples, Psalm 55 and 56, Psalm 87 and Psalm 88. And it also makes sense in a few other Psalms that seem like they don't seem to be intended to be sung, but they're written right after another Psalm that does seem to be sung. So there's some examples of that as well. Anyway, if you want to look it up, look up Thurtle's theory. Just look it up on the internet. It'll pull up. You can read more about it if it's something that interests you. But you know, again, I wouldn't make a Sunday morning devotional out of Thurtle's theory. Probably won't be that engaging or interesting the most. So, but the inspiration of the superscript and subscript, that is something that you want to make sure your people recognize, that that's part of the text. So I always will bring up what's in the superscript as I'm interpreting the psalm, because that's part of. So usually it's background information. So I'll say, notice at the beginning of the psalm, we have some information on who wrote the psalm or when it was written or something like that. And I will read the title, the superscript, as I read the psalm. If I'm going to read the whole psalm, that's part of the psalm. So I'll start with reading the title and going all the way through. Oftentimes when I preach the Psalms, I'll usually just read the title first because I'm giving the background of the psalm. And usually I'll do that in the introduction. So that's normally when I'll bring in the title, because then I'll explain it a little bit. You know, what does this title tell us? It tells us who wrote it, or when he wrote it, or what his situation was when he wrote it. That's usually when I'll bring that up in the sermon. So there you have it. Psalm titles. More than you ever wanted to know, probably, on those. But again, they're very helpful. Many times they're very helpful in giving us information about the psalm that is from the author, that can be very helpful to better understanding what he says within the psalm. Okay, well, other questions or comments, insights, anything that sticks out to you? By the way, Thurtle, I have a reference here. He wrote his book that treated this. He called it The Title of the Psalms, Their Nature and Meaning Explained. And it was published in 1904. So it's over 100 years ago, 120 years ago that he wrote this. So it's a more recent, in terms of biblical time, it's a more recent theory that was brought up. I don't know of anybody before him that addressed that issue, but could be. And I'm sure his book would have that if there was. But besides that, any other questions or thoughts? Well, given the time here, I think next week I'd like to take up the topic of why study the Psalms, and then we'll move to the next section in our study of poetry by beginning in the steps. How do we study a psalm? What steps should we take to accurately interpret biblical poetry, but and especially with the Psalms? What are the steps to take? So we'll hopefully we can get to that next week when we gather together. But again, wanted to open up if there's any questions or comments on what we covered today. Chunsi, did my answer to your question about the background, the Psalms ordering,
Yes.
was that helpful?
Yes. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
I'll note, I think it was session, I'll post the notes again to the session where we covered that in more detail, so you can look at that if you want to get more information.
Yeah, I thought I saw that notes before, but probably
Okay.
not. I missed that session, but I got the notes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, I love the Psalms. They're a favorite of many. Just so rich. So that's why I'm spending all this time going into this detail, because I think it'd be helpful for us in having a right foundation as we approach studying, interpreting, and teaching the Psalms. That there's things like with any book, we need to understand how the book works and what are some important information about the background of the book. So the Psalms are unique. They're a collection of independent poems, but each poem has its own setting, and each poem has its own intention and occasion. And so sometimes the titles give us helpful information about that. Okay, so again, I know it's a little more on the academic side here tonight, but hopefully helpful. We'll get in next week, Lord willing, to the why study the Psalms, and then how to do that.
Yeah, I used Psalm 23 tonight for conversational English, and we really worked on pasture, the cow pasture, the
yeah,
green pastures. They had no idea what a pasture was, and I could really explain that because I am understanding what a cow pasture is, and they didn't even know what a shepherd was. He's a herdsman, taking care of sheep, and there's all kinds of things. Anyway, pronunciation, there's a lot of, and Psalm 23 is real easy for them to read, and that gives them something we can work on. But yeah, I use Psalm 23 a lot when you need something at when somebody's sick, or when somebody needs encouragement or something like that. That's, well, anyway,
yeah.
Praise.
Yeah, and I think the title of that one, it just says a Psalm of David, but just knowing who wrote it also enriches he was a shepherd, so it gives a lot of richness to what he says there.
I used to be a shepherd, so Ot means herdsman.
Oh, I did not know that.
Oh, no, well, that's good. Now you know that. That's
Yeah, I grew up, my grandfather raised cattle, so I had some experience raising cattle from him.
I made most of my money off of pigs, so pigs are really, you can make a lot of. Oh, I'd love to get back into hog farming. Well, that was easy money, man. Those pigs, and the pigs are smart. You know
Yeah.
that a pig has the same genetic code as we do, and that if evolution is true, our ancestor was a pig by scientific discovery. They get the same body worms, everything. When we were in India, we used pepperzine to worm ourselves every month because there were so many parasites there, and that was the same thing we used on our pigs. Oh, I can tell stories about pigs.
So if you call someone a pig, it's actually not an insult then, huh?
Well, no, actually, it's that's my wife always said that's a smell of money.
And another kind of smell too with some of them. Those pigs. We didn't have pigs. We had chickens and horses and cattle. Never raised pigs.
I always thought a horse was really a bad investment, but yeah, we had a lot of horses when I was a little boy. They were still using them for field work.
Yeah, that's how we used them. We used them to herd the cattle. And
kind of on a ranch then.
Yeah. Yeah, my grandfather owned about 440 acres, my grandfather and grandmother. So they had a couple hundred head of cattle that just roamed the property. So one of my jobs is, sorry?
I've got a few hundred acres in, what is it there? It's Great Falls, Montana. My son-in-law and daughter are there pasturing, and they took some of my inheritance and bought some land there.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, that's interesting, but I'd love to have a cowboy hat and go there, but I can't. And it's some of the best. The elk hunting and well, this, what is it? The mule deer. Oh man. And there, the Colorado River is the best trout fishing in the world. And I have to be here in Malaysia with no question about it.
Sacrifices.
Duane and Pastor Tim and Duane, does all your experiences in this with all the animals, does it help you to appreciate more about when you talk about shepherd and the shepherding heart and so on?
I'll tell you, the church in Singapore knows a lot about agriculture. They had a lot of illustrations. It's just rich. And of course, the Bible's just full of agricultural terms and illustrations.
Yeah.
And boy, I get excited over that because I've been there.
Yeah, it does help give some insights. He talks about sheep, being dumb and ignorant. Cattle are the same.
Oh, this last week we
Most.
talked about Paul on the street straight in Damascus. I have been there on street straight in Damascus. Oh man, that tickles me pink.
Yeah, I got a chance to stand on Mars Hill in Athens.
We flew by, but I never got to climb it.
Yeah, it's just it's a big rock. It's not even not even 4 or 5 meters high, I don't think.
Yeah, in '73, we took a tour as a family, and it was only a few $100s at that time by a missionary in Beirut before all of the trouble there. And we got to crawl all over that stuff nowadays that you wouldn't survive crawling over. It's all full of terrorists now, but Bellback and oh man, there's some fantastic things to see there. And then they took a trip over to Damascus at that time. And oh well, anyway, it was interesting. That was in 1973.
Wow.
That's a while ago.
Long time ago.
Nothing developed.
Oh man.
I think it was quite slippery, right? Pastor Tim was quite slippery to climb up Mars Hill, right? Although it's a rock.
Yeah, it's pretty many parts of it are smooth.
Smooth. Yeah, I know. I had to use my hand to slowly to hand and foot to go up, and just in case I'll fall off.
But it was interesting. It gave perspective because you could see the Parthenon up above.
Yes.
And it really, as you read Acts 17, you kind of can see, he's standing with that Parthenon behind him, with where they worshipped all these false gods. And so pretty interesting.
That thing was intact until Napoleon packed it with his arsenal and blew the roof off.
Yeah.
And that was a shame. And then he went down to Egypt and used the Sphinx for target practice with his cannon. That guy needed to have his head examined.
That's why the noses of the Sphinx disappeared because
it got blown off.
Shut it off, blown off.
Oh man.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. A lot of Greeks know about this Mars Hill. I spoke to my Greek friend. He took me there. He wasn't a Christian, just an English professor, but he brought me there and said, this is Mars Hill.
We had trouble finding it because there wasn't really any obvious signs. So we had to ask several tour guides around. Finally, we found one.
Today they have today they have a signage. At that time they didn't have.
Yeah, there's like a plaque on the rock there, but it wasn't highlighted, so it wasn't obvious. But anyway, Dwayne, do you want to close us in prayer?